Happy holidays, everyone! To mark the occasion, here's my review of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, originally released for the SNES, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or Super Famicom in Japan, although it has been re-released on other systems over the years, most notably a Game Boy Advance release, which also included a second game called The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords. I will talk a bit more about the GBA port later on because I do have that as well and I have played through it, but apart from the sections where I'm specifically talking about the GBA version, all the footage you're going to be seeing throughout this video was recorded from the version included in the SNES Classic Edition. Now, folks like myself who've been gaming for quite a long time may think this game needs no introduction, but for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, it's an action-adventure game and the follow-up to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. It is the third game in the Legend of Zelda series, and it was released in November of 1991, originally in Japan, and the following year in North America and Europe, which means that as of November 21st of this year, 2021, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is 30 years old. Upon its original release, it was very well received, and it was also a commercial success, and over the years it has gradually become considered one of the best games ever made by quite a lot of people. And as far as the Zelda series itself is concerned, among its fans, A Link to the Past is also one of the two games you will almost always see come up as the personal favorites in the series, the other usually being Ocarina of Time. Although, to be fair, a lot of which one of those is going to be your favorite is going to depend on whether you grew up with the N64 or grew up with the SNES. There's a bit of a generational gap there. Although, funnily enough, in my particular case, that's not really what happened with A Link to the Past, because I didn't play this game until after I had played Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and actually after I had played Wind Waker as well. You see, I only had very limited access to any Nintendo systems up until I got a Game Boy Advance, and then after that I also ended up getting a GameCube, which my particular GameCube came with the Legend of Zelda collection, which includes Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and a demo for Wind Waker. Now this of course might be confusing to some of you who may not really be familiar with where I started playing the Legend of Zelda series and are trying to get a feel for where I fall into this fan continuum, but I will just go ahead and tell you outright that the very first game in the series I played was Ocarina of Time. I was actually at a party with some friends, and the person hosting the party happened to have a Nintendo 64, and one of the main attractions the entire night was GoldenEye 007 split screen, which you may scoff at now, but back then it was friggin' awesome. But as the party went on, obviously people started to get a bit tired of playing GoldenEye and they would go do other things, and some people of course left the party and such like that. So eventually we decided to just give a different game a try, and that game happened to be The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And so in that kind of awkward one person actually playing the game but other people around trying to assist way, we basically did a sort of co-op run of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, at least for a couple of hours, just to try something different before going back to GoldenEye. And what I played of the game, I certainly enjoyed. So later on down the line, when I finally got my Game Boy Advance and eventually my GameCube as well, I ended up getting whatever Legend of Zelda games I could for both systems and messing around with them. So the way the series ultimately worked out for me was that I started with Ocarina of Time, and then later on down the line when I finally got Nintendo systems of my own, I was able to play the other games in the series, and while I finished Ocarina of Time first, I ended up playing through A Link to the Past, Majora's Mask, and the original Legend of Zelda all around the same time, which results in a weird situation where I have roughly the same nostalgia level for all of those games, and thus where a lot of people will be saying that A Link to the Past is their favorite or Ocarina of Time is their favorite because of nostalgia, nostalgia ends up not playing all that much of a role in that debate for me, so it's really more about what the games actually do. So as far as A Link to the Past is concerned, I'm just going to be assessing it for what it actually is. How it is as an action-adventure game in general, as well as a follow-up to the original Zelda and Zelda 2, and whether or not it still holds up to this day. So let's just go ahead and get things started. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. Now, most of what I'll be talking about here applies to both the original SNES and Super Famicom version and the GBA version, but there are some slight changes between the two. They changed the heads-up display a bit, they changed some of the interfaces a bit, Some of the effects were changed up just a bit, and the color palette in the GBA version is a bit brighter and a bit flatter, but these are things you're probably not going to notice as much if you're actually playing the game. They did a very good job of keeping the two very consistent in terms of visuals, which for the original release anyway, were a huge step up over the previous games in the Zelda series. I mean, you gotta keep in mind, you're going from the NES and Famicom to the Super NES and Super Famicom, and at the time, that was a huge leap forward in terms of hardware capabilities and the visuals and sound that you could produce in a video game. So while A Link to the Past certainly doesn't look like much by today's standards, I mean, after all, it is a 16-bit game, it looked fantastic when it first came out. There's all manner of really nice effects that they've managed to work in there, like rain effects and such like that, on top of having much more colors than the NES and Famicom were even capable of, as well as much more advanced pixel art and animations than what the previous consoles were capable of. And the end result as far as the visuals go is that it actually ends up with something of a timeless quality to it. A lot of these 16-bit games in particular have aged like fine wine, and A Link to the Past is no exception in that regard. It looked fantastic when it first came out, and it still holds up very well to this day, at least as long as you can stomach the whole pixel art thing. I know a lot of people these days can't stand pixel art just because it's in so many indie games, but I think it's pretty easy to get past that when you acknowledge that this game came out when pixel art was basically the only thing you could do with the system, and more importantly, there's just something about really well done pixel art from the SNES and Genesis era that has this timeless quality to it that modern imitations simply don't have. Now sure, there is a slight issue with running this game on a modern television or a modern screen, which is that these old games were designed around common TVs of the era, which all had 4:3 aspect ratio. So if you're running this thing on a widescreen resolution, you're going to end up with black bars on either side of the screen. It's called pillar boxing. And I know there are some purists out there who are going to whine endlessly about the fact that I have adjusted the footage to fit the 16:9 aspect ratio, and they think that completely ruins everything about these classic pixel art games. But frankly, the pillar boxing bothers me far more than people whining about me adjusting the aspect ratio, so they can just deal with it. Anyway, the point is that the visuals were a huge jump forward compared to the previous games in the Zelda series. They look fantastic for their era, and they still hold up very well. But then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get slightly messier depending on which version you're playing. Most of the sound effects are the same between both versions, although the GBA version is usually more bit-crushed, and the same goes for the music, in fact. But for some baffling reason, Nintendo thought they would, air quotes, improve the GBA version by adding in the voice clips that Link had in Ocarina of Time. Only they're pretty heavily bit-crushed, so they really don't sound very good. And on top of that, they just sound really out of place in a game that mostly is classic 16-bit style sounds, where they're more representations of the thing they're actually supposed to be, like swishes of the sword, or clanging against metal, or things like that, than the more digitized sound that you would expect from later games like the N64 and PS1 era. So while it's certainly not a deal breaker or anything, the voice clips that they added in the GBA version definitely sound very out of place. Apart from that, though, everything else is pretty consistent. The GBA version is generally just a more bit-crushed version of the sounds and music that you would hear in the original SNES version, and the SNES version has some solid sound effects that do exactly what they need to for the era, but are certainly not impressive, and while the original version has no voice acting at all, they added it into the GBA version with the Link yelling and screaming and such when he swings his sword and that sort of thing. But then there's the soundtrack, which, regardless of whether you're listening to the more bit-crushed version in the GBA or the original version on the SNES, is absolutely fantastic. There are a lot of truly classic Zelda tunes that first appeared in this particular game, and it also has some renditions of songs from previous Zelda games that were bumped up to 16-bit and thus improved pretty considerably, such as the classic Overworld theme, which not only is synonymous with going on a fantasy adventure in a video game, but on a more personal level, absolutely never fails to put me in a good mood. And when you bring all of that together, you end up with a presentation that was absolutely fantastic when it originally released, and unlike a lot of older games where they've not necessarily aged all that well, this thing still holds up very well in its presentation to this day, apart from the whole 4:3 resolution thing, but that's easily overlooked. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and almost the entirety of the story is exactly the same regardless of whether you're playing the original release or the GBA version, but the GBA version does force you into an unskippable cutscene at the beginning, which, if you were playing the SNES version, actually is the demo crawl, so basically you let the start screen sit there for a while and then it will actually play this cutscene. But this gives you the backstory as to what's going on, which is that long ago there was a portal between the two realms of Hyrule and something that was known as the Golden Land, and in the Golden Land there was this mystical power called simply the Golden Power, which many people desired and ultimately ended up fighting over. But despite there being many who ventured into the Golden Land seeking this power, none returned, and eventually evil started pouring out of the portal between the two worlds, and under the command of the King of Hyrule, 7 sages ended up sealing the portal between the worlds, and thus the tide of evil was stopped, at least people thought it was. And subsequently, peace reigned in Hyrule, until very recently, a wizard named Aghanim showed up out of nowhere, took out the King of Hyrule, bewitched all of his soldiers, and commanded them all to search the lands and find the descendants of these 7 sages, so that Aghanim can tear open the portal between worlds once again, and thus cause evil to spill forth into the world again. And it's in this scenario where we find our hero Link, currently living with his uncle, who is awakened one night by the telepathic cry for help from Princess Zelda, who informs him that she is locked in the castle dungeons, and that terrible things are afoot. Link's uncle tells him to stay home, picks up his sword and shield, and wanders off into the night, and after Link ignores his uncle's advice of staying home and wanders off after him, you end up finding out that Link's uncle was mortally wounded trying to rescue Princess Zelda, and he ends up giving you the sword and shield, tells you to go find and rescue Zelda, and then promptly dies. But rescuing the princess is only the start of the adventure. Once you rescue her, you find out a bit more about what's going on, and you're informed that you really are the only one capable of stopping him, and to do that, you're going to need to seek out the Master Sword, the legendary Sword of Evil's Bane, which has been somewhat lost to the ages, but which you're given a lead on in the form of the Elder of the Village. Once you get there, you find out he's actually left the village, and you have to go find him, and once you do find him, you are told that you need to find 3 pendants, which will prove that you are worthy of wielding the Master Sword. After delving through 3 dungeons and finding all of these pendants, you're able to find and retrieve the Master Sword, but not before Aghanim's soldiers find Zelda and bring her back to the castle. And by the time you're able to confront Aghanim, it's basically too late. He's already prepared Zelda for the ritual, and when you arrive, he basically just looks at you, says, "Haha, you cannot possibly stop me! Now watch as I throw open the portal between worlds!" And then he proceeds to do exactly that and runs away. You chase after him and have a bit of a fight, but he interrupts the fight after taking some damage and casts you into the other world. What was once the Golden Land has now been corrupted into the Dark World. And it's there you'll find the real meat of the story begins, because you're ultimately trying to save both the Light World, or the main world of Hyrule, and the Dark World, and the way you're going to be doing this is by reclaiming the Golden Power for the forces of good. And to do that, you're going to need the help of all of the descendants of the 7 sages, so you go forth into the Dark World to find and rescue them all, in the hopes that their combined powers will help you reclaim the Golden Power and defeat the Wizard Aghanim once and for all. It's actually a pretty straightforward and fairly simple story, but it works pretty well, and for 1991, you weren't really expecting all that much out of action-adventure game storylines. Certainly not if you had played prior Zelda games, which barely had a story to begin with. Thing is, with the new hardware, they had expanded storage capabilities on the cartridges, so you could put a lot more into the game in terms of storyline. You could put cutscenes and dialogue and things like that in. And while story has certainly gotten a lot more important in more recent Zelda games, back when this one released, it was still technically secondary to the gameplay. And that's where things get really interesting, especially depending on which entry in the series you're coming into this one from. You see, if you were going into this after having played the original Zelda and in Zelda 2, you would find that they had ditched pretty much everything that was in Zelda 2 because it just didn't work, and they went back to the same general gameplay style and the perspective that the original Legend of Zelda had. So it takes place from a top-down perspective, and like in the original game, you have a button dedicated for your selected inventory item, and you have a button dedicated for your sword. But unlike with the original game, where you only had 2 buttons and then the selected start buttons to work with, the SNES controller had 4 face buttons. So you have one for your sword, and you have one for your inventory item, but you also have a dedicated action button, as well as a dedicated map button. And the action button is context sensitive, so if you're in front of something that you can pick up and throw, then you will pick it up and throw it. If you're in front of an NPC, you'll start talking to them, and if there's nothing in front of you at all, then you'll start charging up a dash if you have the Pegasus Boots anyway, which is an item you'll get a bit later on in the game. And that will cause you to do a fast dash maneuver that will plow through enemies and cause damage to them, and if you crash into something, then it might break open a new passage, or it'll just jostle something loose that you might have been looking for. But these new controls weren't the only major change to the gameplay. They also added in some degree of height simulation, where this is still definitely a 2D game and it's from a top-down perspective, but they give you some ledges to jump off of, and the effect is convincing enough that you might be tempted to think that there is some degree of third dimension to it, even though there really isn't. On top of all of that, they've also expanded the movement you're capable of doing. In the original Legend of Zelda, you could only move up, down, left, and right, whereas in A Link to the Past, you can now move diagonally as well. And rounding out the core gameplay tweaks, they've also made it so that instead of just attacking with your sword and then once you're at full health attacking with your sword and sending out a sword beam, you now have a few ways of damaging enemies with your sword. The first thing you can do is just use the basic attack, which is a slash, and that goes out in a bit of an arc so you can actually hit things at a sort of diagonal angle as well. Once you have access to the Master Sword and either of the 2 improved Master Swords, you get a sword beam attack, which is really not so much a beam as it is a spiraling magic blast that will move forth out of your sword and hit things as long as you have maxed out hit points anyway. If you've taken even the slightest bit of damage, then it will just be a basic sword attack instead. Or you can hold down the sword attack button, and you will first attack with your sword and then hold it, and that will charge up an attack, which when you let go of the button will cause Link to do a spinning attack. And the spinning attack doesn't just go out in an arc entirely around Link, but it actually does more damage than a standard attack as well, so you're probably going to be doing that quite a bit. So right off the bat, with all of these changes and tweaks, you end up with a game that feels much better to play than the original Legend of Zelda. And that's not to say that the original Legend of Zelda felt like crap to play, it's just that it was an NES game and it was relatively primitive. After all, there's only so much you can do with 2 buttons, a D-pad, and the limited hardware specs of the NES. But when you move to A Link to the Past, not only do you have all these changes and additions for your general walking around, whacking things upside the head and general adventuring stuff, but you'll also eventually get access to an item that allows you to swim in all of the waterways in the game, and you'll also eventually gain access to an item called the Hook Shot, which not only launches out, grabs things, and pulls them towards you, but if it's a solid object, then it'll launch out, grab it, and it might pull you towards it. There's even a fast travel system that you'll unlock eventually that'll allow you to call in a bird that will grab you and then pull you to one of several different fast travel points on the map. And then of course there's the magic mirror, which allows you to travel from the dark world to the light world, or if you're in a dungeon you can use it to quickly go back to the entrance of the dungeon, and any of the progress you've made is retained. And not only do you have all these new traversal options, and that just makes exploring the world all the more interesting, but it's also used as part of the puzzle solving, which has been dramatically expanded compared to the original game. The original game's puzzles were definitely limited by the hardware, but they were all very simplistic. Things like maybe pushing a block, or maybe you blast a hole in a wall or something like that. Well, all of that returns in A Link to the Past, but it's much more complicated. You'll have to move blocks around to a certain pattern, or you'll have to move a statue or some other block onto a switch and hold it down. You might have to blast a hole in a wall and move into a different area and then set something up for when you go to a different floor of the dungeon, and then you can cause something to happen on that higher floor and then go down into the lower floor through the opening that you just made, and thus allow you to access an area that you wouldn't have been able to access before. And with the way the world hopping works, you might have to solve certain parts of the puzzle in the dark world and then go over to the light world and solve the rest of the puzzle there, or vice versa. And while it's all still relatively simple in its structure, it still requires you to get a bit creative with it, and it ends up being some pretty clever puzzle design given the limitations of what they've designed as far as the general gameplay mechanics go. And once you get into the Dark World, you can actually go through some of the dungeons out of sequence. There's definitely an intended order that you go in, but as long as you have all the requisite tools to be able to access a particular dungeon in the first place, generally speaking, you're probably going to be able to go through at least large portions of that dungeon, if not its entirety, out of that intended sequence. And instead of thinking that the game might punish you a bit for that because you're tackling a dungeon that's meant to be taken on a bit later down the line and thus you would have more items available, funnily enough, you might be able to complete one of the later dungeons a bit more easily in your current state, and then go back to one of the dungeons that are meant to be taken on earlier, and then breeze through it. And thankfully, unlike with the original Legend of Zelda or Zelda 2, where the hints that you were given were so vague or so badly translated that they just were completely useless, in this particular game, you do get some hints that are actually quite useful. They'll give you some pretty strong ideas about where you need to go next and what you need to do, and there's a lot more environmental cues about where you can go and what you can do. Things like you'll notice arrow patterns pointing towards things on the map, or notice something odd and out of place, or something odd about a particular bit of scenery that normally would be properly in its place, but there's just something a bit off about it. These kinds of hints were a lot more difficult to pull off on something like the NES because it was just so limited on what the hardware was capable of, that if they were going to try to give more environmental hints, then they would have to be so blindingly obvious that they would practically solve the puzzle for you. A Link to the Past, on the other hand, can have these more subtle environmental hints as well as not so subtle ones. And between hints like those and the conversations you're having with NPCs, you're never really going to run into a situation where you're just wandering around aimlessly going, where do I go? What do I do? At most, you're probably going to be seeing something and go, okay, I know what I need to do in this situation, but how do I go about actually doing it? And whenever the game introduces a new puzzle-solving method or a new item to work into the puzzle solving, it gives you a scenario almost immediately after that's going to teach you how to use that particular item in a relatively controlled setting, so you don't end up with the frustration of trying to figure out what to do with that particular item, while also having to worry about tons of enemies assailing you at once or something along those lines. And once you've gotten through that area, you have the basic idea of that particular item down, and then as you continue to progress through the dungeon, then you'll start to explore a bit more creative uses of it. And once you get to the end of that particular dungeon, chances are, if you've been dealing with a bunch of puzzle solving with that particular item, then it's going to also be involved in the boss fight that you're about to encounter. And by the time you get through the entire dungeon, you'll have a good idea of how that item is used, and you'll be able to apply that in your exploration. You'll also be able to apply it in dungeons moving forward, and that means the game continues to build on itself as you progress, which in turn makes the experience of exploring and solving puzzles all the more engaging. All the while, you'll also be encountering different enemy types that need to be attacked in different ways. In the original Zelda and Zelda 2, they didn't really have all that much variety. They might have an enemy that you need to attack in a specific point, but it was always very straightforward as to how you had to deal with them. Meanwhile, A Link to the Past has that sort of thing as well, but it also has certain enemies that can only be defeated in one particular way, as well as enemies that will mirror your movements, and so you gotta be clever with how you basically walk them into your shots and things like that. And that makes the combat consistently engaging as well, and when you bring all of that together, you end up with an action-adventure game that wasn't just a huge leap forward for its era, it's one that still holds up extremely well to this day. And it even has some nice features that more modern games tend not to, like modern games tend to force you through slow and tedious tutorial sequences, whereas A Link to the Past doesn't need tutorial sequences. It teaches you everything you need to know organically as you're playing. I mean, sure, it'll give you a blurb about an item when you pick it up and it'll tell you what it's used for, but then you explore the use of that through actual gameplay, not just some forced tutorial sequence where it constantly prompts you for what you need to do, or some tutorial video it forces you to watch, or some sequence where it pulls you out of the experience entirely and sticks you into some training environment that's completely removed from anything that you're doing. Now that's not how A Link to the Past rolls. It doesn't treat the player like an idiot, but nor is it so convoluted and messy like a lot of older games are, that it's unintuitive as to pick it up and play it. And that sort of thing is actually a bit of a lost art form. I really haven't seen all that many games recently that have been able to pull that off. Not even other games in the Zelda series, in fact. So the fact that A Link to the Past was able to pull that off back in '91, and more importantly, it's still able to pull it off even to this day, is pretty impressive. And if you're only familiar with some of the more recent entries in the Zelda series, it'll be extremely easy for you to go back and play A Link to the Past as well, because it'll all feel very familiar to you, thanks to this game being where the series identity was firmly cemented. With a lot of these earlier, more genre-defining titles, you have a situation where there's usually one or two games, or maybe even a handful of them, that lay the groundwork, but then there's one that fully cements all of the ideas together in a form that truly works, and works extremely well. To give you an example, Wolfenstein 3D was a decent enough game in its era, but it really just laid the groundwork for what it would effectively perfect with Doom and Doom 2. A Link to the Past basically does the same exact thing both for action-adventure games in general, as well as the Legend of Zelda series. It took all of those ideas that were at least present in the original game, and refines them in a way that both felt fresh and exciting back then, and managed to stand the test of time. After all, the core gameplay of A Link to the Past is ultimately what would influence the designs of all of the subsequent games in the Zelda series, and that has been running strong ever since. Well, at least up until Breath of the Wild, but that's a subject for a completely different video. Aside from that one, and of course some of the spin-off games like Hyrule Warriors and all that, the core gameplay mechanics and core gameplay style of the Legend of Zelda games following this game can all be traced right back to the design principles of A Link to the Past, whether it's 2D or 3D. I mean, a lot of people like to say, oh, well, it all traces its lineage back to Ocarina of Time, but no, it all comes back to A Link to the Past. And as such, it is an absolute must-play for anybody who is a fan of the Zelda series, or is even just interested in the Legend of Zelda series. I'd even go so far as to say it's an absolute must-play for anybody who's just a fan of action-adventure games in general. Because chances are, if you're playing an action-adventure game that was released after A Link to the Past, it was at least influenced in some way by A Link to the Past. It is just one of those games where, much like with, say, the original Doom, or Super Mario Bros. Or something like that, it was just so influential and so important to the history of gaming as a whole, that even if you don't normally like the games in this particular genre, or even games in this series, you should still definitely play it. And as for that whole debate over which game in the Zelda series is the best one and which one truly deserves a place among the best games of all time, honestly, I find the whole debate a bit silly, because if you actually look at it in any critical fashion, the choice is obvious, and you're looking at it right now. I hope you all are enjoying your holiday season. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.